Hi guys, welcome back to the 23rd League, which is Delirium. Going to forewarn you at the beginning of this one, it's probably going to be a little bit longer than some of the others. Conqueror's presence and their influence mechanics are now spawned deterministically, with progress between each influence map tracked on the Atlas itself. You can see this on the left-hand side of the Atlas panel, connected to the Watchstone inventory. The chance for a Conqueror to occupy an Atlas region is now 50% from 33 if the conditions are met. Conquerors will now sometimes grant buffs to map bosses in their region. Improvements have been made to how progress through the Conquerors of the Atlas quests are tracked. If it should be significantly easier to see what your next steps are. You can now clearly see which Watchstones have sextants applied to them when they are in the Watchstone inventory. All these changes were really positive. Xana's mobs. Fortune favors the brave, ambush, abyss, bloodlines, domination, Parandus, beyond, and blight. Delirium. In this league, each area contains a mirror of delirium. When players pass through this mirror, it creates a fog of delirium that spawns new enemies and makes existing enemies tougher. The fog will continue to spread out, and the deeper players venture out, the stronger enemies get. Defeating enemies in the fog adds extra rewards. And enemies within the delirium can drop delirium orbs, which adds a layer of delirium to the entire map, and splinters that combine into a gateway to the simulacrum. Enemies in the delirium can also drop cluster jewels, which are socketed in the outermost sockets of the passive skill tree to create an entire cluster of passive skills and can be modified to grant different passive skills. Base items added are large, medium, and small cluster jewels. And then they added the following currency and fragments. So simulacrum is a map fragment, simulacrum splinter, and delirium orb are currencies. And it added a few unique items as well. The Asylum, Perfidy, and Beacon of Madness. So there's a link to Delirium League, a link to the Delirium Wiki for the mechanic itself, the mirror mechanic. Then there is the Delirium Scaling Reddit thread. Now, Delirium, as a lot of people are probably still not the happiest about, was the Delirium Everywhere League. And it showcased that the nerfs to support gems really hurt a lot of builds. It really massively hurt a lot of builds. Delirium was built at a time when those support gem scaling were at bigger values than they are currently. So there's two different ways I think you can fix Delirium. I think the easiest way is that you just change the flat from 96% to like 50% for max Delirium mirrors. So at 100% Delirious, instead of it being 96%, I think you scale it down to 50%. That way the majority of players can interact with it. And then I think you have simulacrums be in like the 70 to 75 range. And the reason why is because what gating simulacrums at 96% does for the game is it goes the opposite way of where Grinding Gear Games is trying to go. So Delirium forces you to get those huge astronomical numbers for scaling purposes, where Grinding Gear Games is trying to bring down the power level and bring up the difficulty. And Delirium forces the opposite of that to happen, where you have to increase the power level up here. So Delirium's difficulty is more moderate. And unfortunately, it turns into, if you have a really heavily invested into character, Delirium is easy, but it burns people out because every map is gray. And no matter, you may not think you mind that, but it actually does wear on you over time. And so I think the answer for Delirium is you just decrease the difficulty. Maybe you decrease the rewards a little bit too, especially in Simulacrum. But I think you decrease the difficulty just to make it where players don't feel like their build is incapable of doing the content. Because it feels like right now, it's one of the few pieces. It and maybe Cirrus feel like are the gatekeeping mechanics. And unless they're going to do a base damage buff of a lot of the skill gems, and maybe where the end game damage is not up as high, but maybe where the scaling of the gem, it scales less substantially each level, and the base is much higher. So that's one option. But I think if they want to keep the player's power level lower, I think the answer is that you reduce the scaling quite substantially, and it just makes a better experience for everyone. I don't know, like Delirium's one of those things I almost worry about, like players' health with watching like nothing but gray all day. Like it drained me playing Delirium League. I couldn't play as often as much. Like especially from the Endless event. Like I played it much more casually because it just drained me at a much higher rate, especially because Path of Exile, we don't talk about it often because we normally play on the most zoomed out level humanly possible, and we're the furthest away from like the artwork as we can possibly get. But Path of Exile is an absolutely gorgeous game. Like it is absolutely beautiful, and Delirium, while it is rewarding, it cuts down on the beauty of the game, which I think is a real crying shame. Like it's a real shame that Delirium impacts the aesthetic of the whole zone, and maybe there's just a better way to showcase it. Like maybe they just use the mini map and put the fog on the mini map and point to which direction the fog is going on the mini map. So you can follow it directly to the boss if you want to, like for the mirror example. And then if it is a Delirium everywhere, maybe they just tone down the gray scaling, because right now it feels like the gray scaling is just, it's too much, and it's not good. Like it's not good for people to, and it doesn't help that there's a group of players that will always chase whatever the most min-max thing that is humanly possible to do. And Delirium, unfortunately, is almost always the most min-max thing that is humanly possible to do. And so there's a group of players that is always going to chase after Delirium. And I think for their like sake, and to help with their stability and their ability to play the game the way that they want to play it, that we cut the grade down. Just from like a mental health aspect, because it's not good for you. Like seeing different colors, having better immersion is better for you long term than like everything being grayscaled. So Delirium was very well received and implemented. Cluster jewels are a huge amount of diversity into the game, and it is one of the most impactful leagues on how the game is played now, for better and for worse. And yeah, it really is. So it works both ways, right? Like most players feel like their build isn't good enough unless it can do 100% Delirious content or Wave 30 simulacrums, which is meant to be challenging in-game content, right? It's meant to be very, very difficult. And the issue when you put a challenge like that and the mechanism is gated behind something that is maybe not the best solution, for player health, because like, let's be honest, there's people that play 12 plus hours a day of Path of Exile, and if you're staring at gray for 12 plus hours a day into gray fog, that's not good for you. Like, it's just not. It's the same reason that like Seattle has a really high suicide rate, right? It's just not good for you long term. Like, I enjoy a gray, gloomy day. Like, I enjoy them, but not all the time. And maybe we can. I'm sure there's a way to balance it where it's not as egregious as it is currently, while it is still impactful and it's still noticeable. There's got to be a way of changing that somehow, where it's just better for players. Because the most rewarding content shouldn't be in a place where it is actively detrimental for players to play the game. If that makes sense. And I'm not trying to be like a psychologist here or anything, but it can't be healthy long term, right? For you to run nothing but Delirium maps. Like, it cannot be healthy. And I think we got enough backlash from Delirium that maybe the developers understand that the mechanic is a little bit too overtuned for where their player base is in reality. And maybe it's a little bit too built for Headhunter and Mage Blood, and not built enough for the average player. And I feel like Path of Exile does a really poor job of trying to balance around the average player and not caring about the top 1%. Because at the top 1% have a lot of access to everything, right? Because at the end of the day, if you're the richest person on the server, you can do whatever you want to. At the end of the day, right? That's just how any game with an economy works. Is the richest person can always do whatever they want to do because they're the richest person. They get to do that. So if you're that person, right? If you're in that, you can't balance around that person. Because when you try to balance around that person, all you end up doing is harming the majority of the people that play your game. And so I think we don't need to look at why builds were successful for a league. I think the correct approach is to look at why builds weren't successful. I think you get a lot more out of it, out of that journey and out of that form of correction than you do off of trying to fix the top end or trying to fix the meta. I think you get a lot better game is if you look back and you say, okay, why are people not playing Glacial Hammer? If that's the question, why aren't people playing Glacial Hammer? And you try to run Wave 30 Simulacrum with Glacial Hammer, and you realize you're having a really bad time. And then you say to yourself, okay, what can we do to change this? Where Wave 30 on Glacial Hammer feels good. I think you get a lot better game than if you try to focus on, well, why are so many people playing Cast on Crit Forbidden Right? I think looking at the solution the opposite way than what we have done is better for the long-term health of the game. And looking at more ways of bringing other builds to the same level. Because, like, let's be realistic here. If you're putting, let's say, 200 Exalted Orbs into a character, unless there's a mechanical reason it can't do something, right? Like, it's a limitation of the skill. Like Righteous Fire, for instance, it has some limitations of things it just can't do because mechanically of how the skill works, or an Auto Bomber, for instance. But for the vast majority of builds, they should be able to play whatever they want to, and they should be able to do the content just fine. And I think we've long looked at the solution being, well, let's stop with the high-end stuff being the best thing there is, And while that is good, I think that the more productive question is, why is the stuff that isn't high end not working? Is it that players aren't building it right? If the answer is players aren't building it right, then as a developer, what you want to do is you want to showcase how to build it right. Right? So if no one has played Glacial Hammer competitively in 5 years, and you're okay with that, then that's not looking at the best. That's not looking at the way to create the best game possible. And there's always going to be some skills that are better or worse than others, but instead of us constantly taking down the king of the throne, which we've done for years and years and years at this point, I think we would be a lot better served if we would start saying, well, why isn't this build able to do this content? And if they would take a group of skills every league and just do a rework to get them to where they can do that content, right? Specifically, whatever the hard content is at the time. And I get not everyone's going to hit wave 30 of Simulacrum. There's a skill set involved in that too. But if you're having a bad time hitting wave 10, that's a problem. And I think that that's where there needs to be some changes made to the grand scale of the game, which would probably give us the best game possible, which I'm all for. I know this was a long one. I did kind of forewarn you, but I knew I was going to get some game theory stuff because of how Delirium works, because it's naturally polarizing. And I think the way that you approach a polarizing topic is you have to think about the opposite of the way the game developer has previously approached a polarizing topic, because there's a reason it feels bad. There's a reason people don't play Glacial Hammer, and it has nothing to do with damage. It has nothing to do with its damage. And I think if we looked at the game from that perspective, we would just get a better game. And that's what I want, right? I don't ever want Path of Exile to be a bad game. I want it to be the best game it could ever be. Ever. And I think the way we get there is by changing how we look at skill gems and how we look at why looking at the underperforming stuff is more impactful than looking at the outliers. And sure, maybe tone down the outliers like 5-10%. Sure. But get the underperforming stuff into that same threshold. Right? And if they do that, and they make it where mechanically skills that had not been used in 5-10 years are feeling good, well, I mean, you just crack open the build diversity window and you make it where we aren't artificially gating build diversity to 10 builds when a lot more than 10 builds are viable. The reason that we're artificially conflating build diversity to 10 builds is because there's only 10 builds right now that can mechanically do all the content. So instead of worrying about why these builds can, because they should be able to, every build should be able to, within reasonable investment levels. And a Mage Blood shouldn't be the answer for everybody being able to do Wave 30 Simulacrum, right? There should be a better solution than that. Because that's the most common way of getting Wave 30 Simulacrum, is you get a Mage Blood. Oh, okay, done. Okay, I'm done. I got it. Cool. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed it, and y'all have a great one, and I will catch y'all in the next one. Bye, guys.